Franchise players are often referred to as the face of the franchise.
And welcome into another brand new edition of Franchise Players here on WWBG 1470 AM here in the Triad. Also on WTOB 980 AM 96.7 FM if you're in Forsyth County, the Winston-Salem area. You can hear us every Friday evening as well. I'm your host, Desmond Johnson, home of the best interviews, top beat writers, athletes, coaches, authors in the area. A little bit later on, we've got award-winning columnist and sports talk host David Glenn will be showing up live from the ACC Tournament. We've got Kayla Lewis, who is the manager of communications and CSR over at the Greensboro Swarm. She joined us in our Get to Know the Greensboro Swarm series. But right now, he is an author of Fight Songs, a story of love and sports in a complicated South. Wake Forest graduate, class of 94, Ed Southern in the house. What's going on, Ed? How you doing?
Oh, not much. I don't appreciate you telling everybody how old I am, but other than that, I'm doing all right.
Hey, man, I graduated in 03, so I'm around the same area. So you graduated from Wake Forest. In the book, and thank you guys for sending me a copy of this. We had talked last year, some things kind of got all over the place, and by the time we got to this part of the year, never got this coordinated. And I knew I wanted to circle back around to you when I got a chance, especially with the ACC tournament being in Greensboro this year, and we have no idea when it's going to return. They haven't even made any dates past 2024 when we'll be in DC next year. So we don't even know exactly when it's going to be back. Maybe 2027, 2028. But we're looking at a vastly different ACC than what me and you grew up watching, especially on the basketball and football sides. In the book, you write a lot about how the ACC came together and Wake Forest sports history in general. What was something you found out when you were doing the research for this book about Wake Forest sports that maybe you didn't know beforehand?
I think the I'm not sure if I want to say it surprised me, but I was really struck by how centrally involved Wake Forest was in the creation of the ACC. From the get go. I think as with Wake Forest being the smallest school, not just in the ACC but in the Power Five,
right?
People tend to think of Wake as sort of like the little brother, just sort of tagging along. And that was not the case. Even back in 1953, Wake Forest was the smallest school, of the founding members of the ACC, and yet it was an integral part of it from the beginning, and really an integral part of in the history of college sports in North Carolina. Wake was one of the teams in the first intercollegiate football game in the state, and the first intercollegiate basketball game in the state.
Oh, wow.
And so, as small as it is, it's really been bound up in it, ever since the sport started here, at least.
I did not know that. That's actually pretty good info there. And you wouldn't think it with Wake, like you said, being the smallest Power Five school. They've always pretty much been the smallest Power Five school. Beautiful campus. Almost attended there myself. And Wake for me, everyone knows I'm a diehard Carolina fan, but growing up in this area, Wake was always like that other team. If Carolina's not playing, I'm a diehard Wake Forest guy, unless they're playing each other. And even then it's confliction depending on the year. So I love the idea that Wake has been ingrained in this from the very, very beginning, which kind of explains why really when you think of the ACC, you do think of Wake Forest as one of those core schools, not just the first 7 or 8 that were in, but that ACC Big Four. And it's interesting that they were become a part of that Big Four, considering they had just moved to Winston-Salem and they weren't really in the Triangle area anymore with State and Duke and North Carolina. For them to still be kind of included as part of that Big Four, I think it's really gone a long way towards branding Wake Forest. I think a lot of times, when you think of that as a collective, and it helps Wake Forest out as well. Now, I know you wrote this book basically during the pandemic. Describe how hard it was as a diehard sports fan and a writer to basically not have sports for 5 months while you're trying to write a book on sports. Because I had to deal with this myself, putting together a radio network for sports with no sports for like half a year. So walk me through this, because I would imagine it was a little bit harder to, reach contacts and things of that sort. How are you able to compile the material for this during a global pandemic?
Well, luckily I had started reaching out to people and talking to people before the pandemic. And in fact, I write it, that ended up becoming the opening of the book is, I had gone down to my wife's hometown, Birmingham, to talk to folks down there. And, this was the weekend before the 2020, what should have been the 2020 ACC tournament, and so I came back from that trip and then bam, the pandemic hit and everything sort of shut down, at least for a while. As a writer trying to write this book, not having sports for so long, ironically probably helped some because I didn't have that was one less distraction that I had, and time that I would have spent watching sports. Instead, I was able to put into the book. As a sports fan, it was really jarring. I mean, it really, I think, when they canceled the ACC tournament
Yeah.
in 2020, and I described the scene in the book, and it sounds like such a scene from a cheesy movie, but it really is how it happened. That I was working at I was working at home already. Turn the TV on, turn around to fix a sandwich, turn back, and the tournament was done. And for it to happen like that, really brought home how serious it was.
Yeah,
And
I had that written down actually that, you were I thought I'd saw that you were thinking about going on Friday
yeah,
to the tournament. Tradition you go to the Coliseum, you scalp a ticket, get in there for the
mhm,
day. And now it's almost like I associate the ACC tournament with the shutdown because it happened like right there at the beginning, like almost simultaneous. The Rudy Gobert thing and then the ACC tournament
yeah,
it was all like in a 24-hour stretch where like everything just started crumbling like in front of
yeah.
us. Nobody knew what was going on. What were your thoughts in that period from the Rudy Gobert going positive thing to I think it was Syracuse and Carolina where was the last game that was played that night,
Yeah.
and then the next day they came back and then realized, okay, this is going, we can't even play or whatever, and they just awarded it to Florida State. That was the regular
Mhm.
season champion at the time. The whole thing was weird. There was nobody in the
Yeah.
Coliseum. Give me your thoughts then, like from 3 years ago when this first started. Like, did you really had it really sunk in, like what was happening? Because we've never seen anything like that before.
No, and I really did. And right up until the moment they canceled it, I think, part of there was part of you that was hoping, well, let's just get through this. Part of you that's sort of, at least for me, that was telling myself over and over again, I can't be that serious. It can't be that serious. It can't be that serious. And then, all right, I guess it is that serious. To be confronted with something like that, and it really, I guess, it speaks a lot to the historical moment that we're in. That we have come to expect our entertainments to be there for us. Um, even 9/11 didn't disrupt sports for that long.
Yeah.
Um, but to see him shut down for this length of time, and then even the weirdnesses of, when they were going to try to play the tournament but not let the fans in, and that seemed strange and wrong. I mean, it's funny. It's really hard to remember my thoughts because my thoughts were so confused in
Mhm.
the moment. It's kind of hard to get a feel for them. They were just so all over the place.
The one exchange I do remember during that time, I had a old high school friend of mine. Her family owns a large car dealership here in the area, and she had took her mom to the tournament that night to watch. She's a Wake Forest graduate, so they had watched the Wake game and then they watched Syracuse Carolina, and she messaged me and was like, "Hey." Because I think Wake had lost, so they were like they weren't going to be coming back. And she was like, "Hey, I've got extra tickets. If you want to use these for the rest of the tournament, you can have them." And I was like, "Yeah, I'll get back with you the next day." That was that Wednesday or Tuesday or whatever after the Syracuse Carolina thing. The next day, everything started falling apart, and I had to message her and be like, "Hey, I don't know if anybody's gonna be able to go back in here for this. I don't even know if they're going to finish
Yeah.
it." And by the end of the day, they basically ruled out completing it out. Ed Southern with us, author of Fight Songs, A Story of Love and Sports in a Complicated South. I haven't even got over to the SEC portion of this yet in terms of what you had found out in terms of writing about this, you kind of learned the ACC was founded not for basketball but for football, which actually it took me by surprise. I kind of knew it. I watched the 10-part ACC tournament series that was on ACC Network. How the AC was founded. I'm aware of how the conference came about, but they even in that they kind of framed it like, yeah, football was king here in the area, but it was never like made out to be that they did it for football. It was almost like they try to frame it as if they did it for basketball, but you found out that it was actually founded for football, not basketball. My question is, why is there such a rabid fandom for football in the SEC and basketball in the ACC? Like, why is that not the same in the SEC in terms of basketball in the SEC when you got a Kentucky and an Arkansas and all these other teams that have won titles? What's the difference between, is it just winning? Is it because the SEC wins more in football and the SEC wins more in basketball, or is it deeper than that?
I mean, the short answer is yes, it's because of the winning. But then the question that I have is, well, why is it that the sort of the core SEC teams win more at football than they do at basketball, and the ACC is the reverse? With all apologies to Clemson and to Florida State, and that was really, I mean, in some ways, that was the question that the book was trying to answer. And so I don't think you want me to go on for the equivalent of 300 pages in this radio interview about why that is. But there are, the more I looked into it, there are some pretty deep reasons that go back pretty deeply into our history about why the passion for football is so much more in the rest of the South, or most of the rest of the South, than it is in North Carolina. One of the easiest ways to answer that is, North Carolina does have a Big Four. We've got four schools that are considered, that are the members of the ACC that are considered sort of at the top of the pyramid in Carolina, Duke State, and Wake Forest, who are competing for recruits.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's a lot easier to get, 5 great players for basketball than it is to get 22 great players for football.
That's a good point.
And so, it's just the simple numbers involved. As opposed to, if you're in South Carolina, you've got 2 major schools in Clemson, South Carolina. In Alabama, you've got Alabama and Auburn, even Georgia, Georgia and Georgia Tech.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. But then there are also, North Carolina, at the same time that the Big Four were becoming quote unquote basketball schools in the 50s and 60s and sort of cemented it in the 70s. North Carolina was trying to set itself apart in the public perception from the rest of the South, where you weren't going to have a governor of North Carolina do a stand in the schoolhouse door like George Wallace did at the University of Alabama. I don't think there was any kind of like causal relationship between the two, but I think the two phenomena did sort of feed into each other. That this was another way that North Carolina could set itself apart from the rest of the South by being more of a basketball state than other Southern states were.
Who was your favorite Wake Forest basketball player and era? Can you pick an era that you enjoyed more than others, and a player in particular?
I
know it's hard to
mean,
pick one.
say that again.
I said, I know it's hard to pick just one.
Yeah, it really is.
Forest guy.
That is an unfair question to ask me. When I was and one of the nice things is that when I was a kid, I would have said that the early to mid '80s, were a golden era for Wake Forest basketball when Carl Tacey was the coach.
Yeah,
and
you talking like
I guess from
Muggsy
that
Bogues era, like in there.
Yeah, and Muggsy would have been my favorite player, from that era. But then I went to Wake in the early to mid '90s, and even though I was there in the Greensboro Coliseum in '95 for that ACC title and watched Randolph Childress go off that weekend, my favorite player from that era was Rodney Rogers.
Oh yes, yeah,
just
absolutely
adored Rodney Rogers. He was so much fun to watch. But then as in my younger adulthood, when I moved back to Winston-Salem, I was able to have season tickets and see Chris Paul play. in the Skip Prosser, the kind of the apex of the Skip Prosser era, which was sadly cut short. And that seemed like a golden age of Wake Forest basketball.
Yeah.
If you have to say, all time, my personal favorite, I mean, the best is obviously Tim Duncan, but I think Rodney Rogers would be my personal favorite of all the
Yeah.
players I've seen play in the old Gold and Black.
I was thinking back on it. I forgot how explosive Rodney was. He
Yeah.
honestly, thinking back on him and his game, the comparison I'll keep landing on is Larry Johnson, UNLV. He
Yeah.
was maybe a slightly taller version of Larry Johnson, but his game was pretty similar. You could shoot it, power dunks, post moves, everything you wanted really in that era where it was still back to the basket type post players that got in there and got dirty. Rodney was one of the better players in the league throughout his career at Wake, and he actually made Wake Forest basketball super exciting during that
Yeah.
time period. I can't hate that pick at all. Real quick before I get you out of here, Ed, give me your thoughts on NIL transfer portals, how it's going to affect your school, Wake Forest, because we're already seeing the effects of that right now. Of course, like you say, you're the smallest Power 5 school. Forbes, the head basketball coach at Wake, he's taking advantage of the transfer portal. We've seen players like Ty Appleby get NIL deals. And then, of course, Dave Clawson over at Truist Field and the football team, they've thrived on a particular set of what he does. They redshirt guys, they keep him a little longer. I don't know so much if they've been dabbling in the portal as much as Coach Forbes has, but they both have their own unique methods of building their teams, and they both have seen relative success. I know Coach Forbes has only been here for 2 years, but they've seen relative success for what they've had to go through over the past couple of years, especially with COVID. Give me your thoughts on Forbes and Clawson and what they're doing with the football and basketball programs and that thought of NIL portal, all this stuff in general. Is it bringing down college athletics? Because I do feel like this year, college basketball in particular, kind of lacked a little something. I don't know if that's because the ACC was kind of down and we didn't really have any top 10 teams for most of the year. And maybe that affects college basketball as a whole. And that's a whole other segment that we could probably go on. But give me your thoughts on this whole, I don't call it a mess, but this whole situation going on in college athletics right now.
I'm completely in favor of NIL and the transfer portal. I don't think either one of them was introduced or has been handled well. I think, I mean, I don't know that there's a more obvious statement you can make in college sports right now than the NCAA has not provided the leadership that they should have and, set some parameters, done some talking. Instead, they tried to, hold back the inevitable and really, keep to a fundamentally broken system for as long as they could, rather than try to take steps to make the system better and say, these players ought to be allowed to profit off their name, image, and likeness, just as their schools and just as the NCAA has. These players ought to be allowed to go to different schools if the situation isn't working out for them, where they are. If the coach that they commit to can up and leave, the player ought to be able to up and leave. So it should have been handled differently, but I'm glad that they exist now. I think what Clawson and Forbes are doing, it really it's remarkable. The jobs that they're doing at a school like Wake Forest and near like this, with the disadvantages you have, not just in terms of the size of the school, but frankly, the size of Winston-Salem. When you think about like comparison schools, one obvious one is Vanderbilt. So Vanderbilt's in Nashville, which is a much bigger place than Winston-Salem is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is going to be a challenge for Wake, but then it's always been a challenge for Wake to compete at the Power Five. And all in all, we've done pretty well at it. So I'm not nearly dumb enough to try to make a prediction of where all this is going to go. But I just hope that we'll manage to keep the things that we love about sports, the things that draw us to sports and keep us coming back year after year. And I hope that whatever happens, that will remain.
You can pick up his book, Fight Songs, A Story of Love and Sports in a Complicated South, on Amazon or any place where you can find books online or brick and mortar. Actually, you can find it everywhere the books are sold. A great
bookmarks
read.
in downtown Winston-Salem.
There you go. Great read. I definitely recommend picking it up. I'm actually going to go back and read through it again after the tournament's over with and kind of get me in the mood for the NCAA tournament. Ed Southern, appreciate you, man, for coming on to Franchise Players, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Appreciate you having me.
Coming up, award-winning sports talk host, author, professor, lawyer, David Glenn, joining us in his bi-weekly spot on Franchise Players here on WWBG 1470 AM and TobaccoRoadSportsRadio.com and WTOB 980 AM.
In professional sports, a franchise player is an athlete who is not simply the best player on their team, but one that the team can build their franchise around for the foreseeable future.
Welcome back to Franchise Players here on WWBG 1470 AM. Every Friday during your TGI Friday lineup. Every other week, bi-weekly, we're blessed to have award-winning columnist, sports talk host David Glenn here with us. He is actually at the ACC Tournament in Greensboro right now. DG, what's going on, man?
I am doing great, Tez. It's good to be with you again.
So I was just telling you off the air, so I do have media passes. JP Mundy put in for passes for me and him to go. Both of us have been so busy, we haven't been able to go out there except for when I picked up mine on Tuesday. And it was my first ACC tournament. I'm wandering around. I'm running into Brian Hall from WFMY and just random folks that I know in the industry. And I felt naked because I didn't know where to go. I didn't know I didn't know where to sit. I didn't know what to do. And I'm looking at the media chart and I'm just trying to figure things out. And I'm like, well, I'll come back later in the week when I see more of my folks in here. So I'm hoping to run into you before the tournament is over with. They're getting ready to tip off here to open up the sessions here. Wanted to hit you a couple things real quick as we do every other week on Franchise Players. First, I wanted to get your thoughts on I guess you could call it retirement of Jim Boeheim. It kind of felt awkward yesterday. Walk me through this, because it didn't sound like to me that Boeheim was ready to go, but he was accepting of the fact that Syracuse was, I guess. That press conference after that Wake Forest-Syracuse game on Wednesday, where he was kind of deflecting a little bit, and then the school comes out with their statement afterwards. Give me your take on this whole situation, because it wasn't like the way Coach K or Roy or any of these other guys retired that we've seen the past couple of years.
Yeah, I was there. I was probably, 20 feet from Jim Boeheim, and that thing was weird, that post-game press conference, because after Jim Boeheim doing songs and dances and talking in circles and not answering anybody's questions with direct answers, Syracuse's official athletics website tweeted out, "Thank you to Jim Boeheim."
Yeah.
And a few minutes after that, they tweeted out, "Congratulations and welcome to Adrian Autry." For those who don't know, that's been Coach Boeheim's right-hand man on the Syracuse coaching staff, and of course, it's his former player. I just attribute it to Jim being Jim. I actually like Jim Boeheim, but he is a quirky personality. He loves to battle with the media, and depending on who asks him a certain question, he might not want to give that person the satisfaction of a direct and complete answer. Now, I don't know all those dynamics because I'm not on the Syracuse beat. But everybody who's been around Jim long enough has mostly good moments, usually, but the occasional, hold your breath, I hope the volcano doesn't explode moment. And the reality was, Jim emphasized repeatedly that he had the option to retire, but that he had not chosen that option, which, of course, you had to read between the lines. Nobody wants to call it a firing. Nobody wants to dismiss a Hall of Fame coach. That's been with you for literally a half century, which is crazy. Longer than most of the people on press row at the ACC tournament have been alive.
Right.
That's how long Boeheim's been a player or the head coach at Syracuse. So nobody wanted to frame it as a dismissal. So this is just trying to, win the narrative and make it look like everybody's walking away with smiles on their faces. Although even at 78 years old, Jim Boeheim sounded like a man who would have coached at least one more year.
Yeah, it sounded like the way he was answering those questions that basically the school had decided, okay, this is your last year, and he did not agree with it, but didn't really have much of a choice. So it's not exactly a firing, just kind of a what's the term we use in business? A mutual separation, I guess, is the best way to put it there. David Glenn with us live from the Greensboro Coliseum, the ACC men's basketball tournament going on right now. Another coach that had his basketball coaching career in the ACC in Greensboro this week in the ACC was Notre Dame's Mike Gray. DG, over the past few years, the league has lost Coach K, Roy Williams, now Jim Boeheim, Rick Pitino, and now Mike Gray. Miami's Jim Larinaga and FSU's Leonard Hamilton are both 70-plus years of age. Do you think we'll ever see a collection of coaches in a conference like this again? And do you think that that's part of our current league perception, that it's been a drainage of talent, not from the player side, but from the coaching side?
I don't think we'll ever see that lineup of head coaches again. For one reason, remember, Des, when guys like Dean Smith got into the business way back when, it certainly wasn't for the money, because those guys weren't making big bucks in the 1960s and 1970s. The coaches now, some of them might say they're not in it for the money, but they're all at the highest level getting paid a lot, which means they might be less likely to hang around into their 70s the way Boeheim and those other guys you mentioned did. I came into this league 36 years ago when, hard to believe, but there's Dean Smith at Carolina and Mike Krzyzewski at Duke and Jim Valvano at NC State and Terry Holland at Virginia and Cliff Ellis at Clemson and Bobby Cremins at Georgia Tech and Gary Williams at Maryland. So that was one glory days right there when I was a little baby, a cub reporter at the end of the 1980s. I remember a day at ACC Operation Basketball where I got to interview one-on-one 4 straight Hall of Famers. And I don't even mean someday Hall of Famers. I mean guys that were already at the time in the Hall of Fame. And it was Roy Williams, Mike Krzyzewski. At the time, Rick Pitino was at Louisville. And I'm sorry if I'm yelling at you and your audience, but there's a lot of ACC tournament music and band playing and craziness behind me.
That's great.
So this is another glory days of ACC coaches that is coming to an end. Now you still have Tony Bennett at UVA. You still have ACC Coach of the Year Jeff Capel at Pitt, who's a relatively young guy. We'll see how many of these others pan out. We're not sure. But it's a time of anxiety because ACC basketball has been a brilliant brand for, basically the entirety of the 70-year existence of the league. You and I have talked about how it's fallen behind financially. It always seems to be playing catch-up in football, which is the most important sport nowadays and has been for a while financially. To see it come back to earth in men's basketball is a little bit scary because it is so central to the ACC's identity. They're going to have to make these coaching hires the right hires. Hubert Davis has to work out at Carolina. John Shire has to work out at Duke. Kenny Payne has to work out at Louisville. Adrian Autry at Syracuse to go with guys like Tony Bennett and Jeff Capel and others. It's a wild, unpredictable time, and that makes most people in the ACC very nervous.
Award-winning sports talk host and columnist David Glenn joining us from chapelworld.com, live from the ACC men's basketball tournament at the Greensboro Coliseum. Give me some thoughts on North Carolina Athletic Director Bubba Cunningham this week. He basically talked about this idea of unequal revenue distribution amongst the ACC schools, I guess in an attempt, because Florida State and Clemson this week, their ADs came out and said, hey, we need more money. We're contributing more into this. We should get more out of it. It's really, since the beginning, it's all been equal split amongst the teams, whether it was 8 teams, 12 teams, whatever it was. Now you're starting to hear some of the bigger names get into this. What are your thoughts on that? Can it work in the ACC?
Well, it's an absolutely huge change if it happens. Because, Des, in my 36 years covering the ACC, no matter who the commissioner was, it was taboo to suggest anything other than equal revenue sharing. And in fact, for many years, the ACC would quietly and sometimes privately make fun of the way the Big 12 and some other major conferences did it. In those leagues, the Longhorns and the Sooners would complain how much more money they made for the league than everybody else. And gradually the other schools started to kowtow to that, so that the Texas and Oklahoma slice of the financial pie was allowed to be bigger by those leagues' bylaws. Well, sure enough, in the end, that didn't satisfy Texas and Oklahoma, even though they were given larger pieces of the pie. When they had a chance to make it a leap to another league, they took it, and they're on their way to the SEC. So it's a very divisive, emotional topic. But last fall, for the first time in my 36 years, and for as far as I know, the first time in 70 years of ACC history, the ACC commissioner, now Jim Phillips, mentioned that he was open to discussing something different than equal revenue sharing. What does that mean? Well, the schools that bring more money to the table, football powers like Clemson and Florida State in modern times, but also large public universities with a big brand like in North Carolina. It is not mere coincidence that the athletic directors who have come out vocally in favor of exploring something other than equal revenue sharing are the ADs at Clemson and Florida State and North Carolina, because they're the ones that bring in more money. They're the ones that would benefit from something other than equal revenue sharing. There may be a national anthem going on behind me, so I apologize. Now I'm whispering, but that's the bottom line with the discussions about possibly giving those who bring more money to the conference table getting that bigger slice of the conference pie.
Hold on, let me mark this time because I can edit. We're going to do the national anthem, so you have to talk. With a play of the national anthem performed today by the Miami Pep Band.
Thank you, bud.
Yeah, man. I knew it was coming.
I would have had to run down a hallway or something. I don't want any Patriots glaring at me.
Well, let me mark it here. Okay. DG, it feels like a goodbye of sorts in Greensboro with the ACC headquarters moving to Charlotte and the tourney not returning until an unknown date. Actually, they haven't set any dates after 2024. We've been told Greensboro's in the rotation along with Charlotte and DC and a few others. Can Charlotte replace Greensboro in the hearts of those like us that have grown up basically synonymous ACC tournament, Greensboro Coliseum? Can Charlotte take that place going forward, or do you think that this is kind of like one of those things where we're seeing the beginning of a different type of ACC?
Short answer, no. Charlotte cannot replace Greensboro and its place in the ACC culture anytime soon. And just to give you some quick numbers, in the first 51 years of the ACC's existence, the ACC tournament was held on North Carolina soil more than 85% of the time. In the last 20 years, it has been out of state roughly as often as it has been in state. And that underlines, of course, the reality that the ACC used to be this little old 7, 8, or 9-team league with 4 of those schools being from North Carolina or based in North Carolina. And now those same 4 are only 4 out of 15. So when the votes come around to where to have this thing, I think it's going to continue to be, even though you're right, they've only announced through 2024 DC. I think we're going to continue to have a roughly 50-50% in-state versus out-state rotation. When it is in-state, I still think they're going to have Greensboro in that rotation in this next round of voting. Now, will that be the case 10 or 20 years from now? I don't know. Time can change a lot of things, and maybe time makes Greensboro less and less relevant as younger people who forget its roots get older and older. But for the upcoming decade, for this next round of ACC tournaments, I would expect half in-state, half out-of-state, and both Greensboro and Charlotte to get, their share of the tournaments when it's still held on North Carolina soil.
I never really even thought about that, the league has expanded so much that, when I was a kid, half the league was from North Carolina, the state of, and now it's only 4 out of 15 schools that are actually from North Carolina. It never even really crossed my mind that that's an inconvenience to say Miami to come up here or Syracuse to come down here or whatever it may be. Real quick, and I'll get you out of here because I know they're about to start in there. Former ESPN president John Skipper, he put an interesting idea out there. We've talked about it a little bit with all the realignment and teams moving from here and there. Basically a merger idea between the Pac-12 and the ACC. They talked about having a relationship months back when they were trying to figure out how they were going to navigate this. Both conferences are kind of in the middle of issues with their media deals. The Pac-12 is searching for one, can't seem to find one. The ACC is locked into one that's not really paying their teams the amount of money to keep up with the SEC and the Big Ten. Is this to create a 24-team super league between the Pac-12 and the ACC? Do you think that that's inevitable to save both leagues, say 8-10 years down the line, the way that college sports is going?
I don't think it's inevitable, but I don't laugh away the idea the way some people are mocking that idea, because the reality is the ACC is already way behind both the SEC and the Big Ten financially. Now, so are the Pac-12 and the Big 12, so the ACC has plenty of company in that regard. But whereas little by little, they hope the move of the headquarters from Greensboro to Charlotte will help financially. They know that full distribution of the ACC network has helped financially. They're running out of ways to minimize that financial gap with the Big Ten and the SEC. One option, the dream option would be for Notre Dame to join as a full member, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So One of the only other options on the table would be, if not, I would be surprised, Des, if the ACC just absorbed the entire Pac-12. And the reason I say that is there aren't enough Pac-12 schools that bring value. Now, Oregon and Washington bring value. UCLA and Southern Cal bring value, but they're already on the way to the Big Ten. If you told me that there was going to be some wild alliance where those 4 most prominent Pac-12 schools set up some kind of weird, conference-like pod system where they were new members of the ACC, like with an asterisk, I would consider that, because we all know TV money is what is the tail wagging this dog right now. And the ACC is not only way behind, it's getting further behind. The Big Ten just signed a $1 billion a year plus series of TV deals. And the ACC, remember, its current deals run through 2036. So if they're stuck with these sort of under market value deals all the way through 2036, their gap is only going to grow as they fall further behind the Big Ten and the SEC. Will that scheduling alliance or whatever you call it become a reality? Maybe. But again, I don't see just like that 24-team merger that you were describing.
Just heard that buzzer, so that means it's time for us to get out of here. I'm gonna let you enjoy the game. I'm hoping to get down there and see either later on tonight on Friday or championship on Saturday. I just got to make sure again I don't show my fandom on press row while I'm there. Got to get clowned by multiple members of the media while I'm in there. So, DG, always a pleasure having you, man. We'll have you back in 2 weeks. At that point, we'll be knee deep in NCAA tournament action. So we'll see who got in from the ACC. Who's got a shot to get pretty far, if any. So we'll get to all that when you come back in a couple of weeks. Enjoy the ACC tournament, my friend. I'll see you there probably the next day or so.
Happy March Madness to you, my friend. I always enjoy being on your show, and it'll be even greater honor to see you again in person. Keep up the good work.
Coming up, More from franchise players here on TobaccoRoadSportsRadio.com and WWBG 1470 AM, WTOB 980 AM.